right around through all the south, up to the north, up to the Russian Federation, different vignettes about the way in which Europe isn't just north, south, or east, west, but there's more than everything. Now, the senior European experts, if you don't know the senior European experts, Lord Canny is here, chairman of it today. They write, and I commend them to you, very interesting papers which are circulated in business, government and academia. And they consist of ambassadors to Brussels, to the United Nations and other parts of Europe. Some of them have been heads of the diplomatic service or held high posts in Brussels. So their papers are well thought through and well researched. And 3 times a year we work here with our modest institute with the senior European experts to inform, we hope, audiences like you. So that's enough from me, and I'll invite Angie Lebrecht, who's the member of the senior European experts, and was very involved with the development of the paper which is having in the papers. And then the other 3 distinguished speakers will comment in their own ways quite shortly, because we always spend short times on talking, and hope we have opportunity to hear from you as well. And I think, though, I would say that there's probably not anything more important in Europe at the moment than energy. It's bubbling to the surface. It doesn't show very much in the elections here. But I was in Brussels a month or so ago listening to a lot of senior officials talking about all sorts of things. But what they talked about mostly was energy. Because if we don't get energy right, we're going to get a lot of things wrong. So after today, the proceedings will be electronically available, and also we'll publish them. But in the meantime, may I thank you for coming and welcome Andy Lebrecht to introduce the senior European experts paper. Andy.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I'm delighted to be invited to open this seminar on the EU's proposals for energy union. And I hope you've had a chance to look at our paper, which sets out the background to the debate, and if you haven't, do look at it afterwards. What I'd like to do is to talk briefly about what I think the term energy union means, and then I'll consider what realistically may be deliverable under this heading. But before I do that, I just want to say something about the political context within the European Union. The EU member states have traditionally given the Union very limited powers in terms of energy law. Indeed, the treaties explicitly reserve to each country responsibility for development of their energy resources and their choice of energy mix. And the member states guard those powers jealously. There are also some fundamental differences between member states' views in the energy sphere, most acutely on the role of nuclear energy, but also on the role of competition in energy markets and on the use of targets to drive change. And each country has its own energy mix, its own priorities for future development. So the conditions for ready agreement on an expanded EU role are far from ideal. Nevertheless, recent years have seen increasing recognition that many elements of energy policy have to be addressed at the EU level. This has led to a range of measures dealing primarily with internal market, climate change, and security of supply. And recent developments in the Union's eastern neighbourhood have made the need for action more pressing. And so the Commission's proposals for energy union, which they published last February, are very much the culmination of a succession of calls by EU heads of government for further action. So that's the political context. What about the term energy union? Well, the Commission states it's going to be, and I quote, secure, sustainable, competitive and affordable energy for EU consumers, which will require a fundamental transformation of Europe's energy systems. Unfortunately, I have to say the Commission then elaborates its vision at great length, and I've only got 7 minutes, So instead of reading out the Commission's definition of energy union, let me summarise the three things I think it's about. Firstly, it's about establishing a well-integrated, fully functioning, EU-wide single energy market. Secondly, it's about ensuring secure supplies from within and outside the Union. And thirdly, it's about doing this in the context of the EU's climate change policies, envisaging a transformation to a low-carbon economy. Moreover, this must be achieved, according to the Commission, whilst keeping energy prices affordable so that political support is sustained. So what does this mean in practice? Is there anything new in what the Commission proposed? And is it deliverable? It's clear that the single market in energy is not yet working effectively. Gas and electricity do not flow freely across borders everywhere. Prices are anything but common, and some markets experience very limited competition. Happily, the Commission has not chosen to propose complex new legislation to deal with these. That would, I'm sure, tie up the Union for 3 years in trying to negotiate. What it said instead is that the third energy package, which was agreed with great difficulty in 2009, is for the main part the right framework. But what is needed, and what the Commission states as its first priority, is rigorous enforcement both of competition law in the energy sector and of the energy market legislation, so that it is fully implemented by all Member States, which currently it isn't. The central requirement of this legislation is called unbundling. That's the separation of energy transmission from its supply. And that rule applies equally across the Union, whether to RWE, to EDF, to the National Grid, or to third country firms such as Gazprom. Effective enforcement is essential to enable competition to flourish, permit cross-border flows of energy, and create the confidence necessary for investment. The Commission is, however, proposing to strengthen the powers and independence of the central regulatory bodies and to redesign aspects of the regulation of the electricity market. And in addition, it recognises that an effective single market requires the Union to support investments in energy infrastructure in certain circumstances, for example, to link energy islands like the Baltics or Iberia to the main grid, and also to stimulate and underpin renewable energy production. In terms of security of energy supplies, the EU is dependent on imports for over half of its needs. Improved energy efficiency is one means of addressing this problem. And the Union has potential to increase its own production of low-carbon energy in the form of renewable energy, nuclear, unconventional gas, and fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage. But the main focus is rightly on ensuring security of external supplies, especially of gas, where the Union has particular problems with the reliability of some of its suppliers and is therefore highly vulnerable to external shocks. Certain Member States are especially exposed through high dependence on just one supplier. And the solution to this is to diversify its sources of energy, its suppliers, and its supply routes. And here the Commission identifies three main approaches. The first is to continue promoting investment in new investment and new supply routes, primarily liquefied natural gas terminals and the southern corridor from the Caspian Sea. Secondly, it would enter into strategic energy partnerships with a range of important producing and transiting countries. These include, as you would expect, Turkey, Ukraine, African, Caspian and Middle Eastern countries, but also the US and Canada. And finally, the Commission wants greater transparency in gas supply agreements between Member States and third country suppliers, so that it can ensure in advance that the agreements are consistent with EU legislation and security of supply needs. This latter requirement is a very sensitive issue which has generated heated discussion amongst Member States. Some countries like Poland will want to give the Commission a stronger role. For others, like Germany perhaps, it may go too far. In my view, it's essential to do something along these lines if more vulnerable EU countries are to avoid being unduly exploited by a dominant supplier, as is clearly happening at present. The context for the Energy Union, as I've said, is the EU's climate change strategy, which, amongst other things, envisages an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and virtually carbon-free electricity generation by 2050. Two key elements of this policy are improved energy efficiency and increasing use of renewable energy, which lie at the heart of the Energy Union. The heads of government set new targets in October for renewables and energy efficiency to be met by 2030. And whilst many of the specific actions in these areas are for the Member States to decide, the Union will have an important part to play, for example, in ensuring cross-border infrastructure, supporting innovation and research, and preventing distortion of the competition. And the eventual outcome, I think we can predict, will be a very different European energy system than the one we know today. Let me conclude with some key questions. Is all this coherent? Is it ambitious enough? Do the Member States have the political will to make it a reality? Will the markets finance it? I hope the rest of this debate will shine some light on these and other pertinent questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. That's a really good overview of the Senior European Experts paper and also of the introduction to the subject. I should point out that I haven't briefed any of the speakers from what angle they should come, because I think they should choose their own angle depending on their own research, their own interests and their own capabilities. So may I straight away ask you next to welcome Nick Butler, visiting professor and chair of the King's Policy Institute, King's College London.
John, David, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be asked to join this discussion. I just want to add a few points to what's already been said from a slightly different perspective. I start from the view that the energy policy document, which was approved in March, is actually more important and more symbolic of what is happening in Europe than has been realised, certainly in the media coverage here, and probably right across the European Union. I think it is more ambitious, and it is reflective of a new Commission, which, if you look in detail at what they're doing, is itself much more ambitious than any of its recent predecessors to re-establish the idea of an ever closer union within Europe and to put substance behind those words. And I think that this policy in particular is going to have far greater impact over time than people would get picked up. The paper that was published at the end of February and nodded through at the March meeting is actually, of course, quite modest. It doesn't attempt to tell Member States what their energy mix should be. It doesn't tell the French that they have to get involved in fracking for gas or oil. It doesn't tell the Germans that they have to persist with nuclear power. It doesn't establish the idea of a single buyer buying all the gas that Europe imports, which is what Mr. Tusk had wanted. And it doesn't require uniform pricing or uniform tax systems to apply in the energy market. But it does something that is actually more important than any of those things, which is to establish a new level of EU-wide competence, which is put in place above national decisions in the interests of security of supply, which is, of course, the issue of the moment, and the issue which is driving the thinking behind what has been written. The focus is on, as has been said, opening the market within the EU, plus the development of infrastructure to link one part of the EU with another part. And that is quite right, and it's long overdue, not least because the countries in Eastern Europe are, for energy purposes, and particularly in terms of gas and electricity, still part of Comecon. The supply lines flow from Russia to Eastern Europe, not from Western Europe to the east. This policy has to be seen alongside climate policy, the emissions target, 40% reduction, which is now firm commitment, and the aspirations to improve efficiency and renewables. And together, they create a new level of EU-wide policy which no member state can ignore. I think the process will, from now on, be dynamic and accretive. I don't see, reading the document carefully, how the current proposals on infrastructure and open markets can be enacted under current legislation, because a really open market with cross-border links right across all the member states would break down the local structures which have existed for the last 30 or 40 years. I see no way at the moment, for instance, that EDF, the main energy supplier in France, would accept open market supplies coming in from Spain, which would undermine the market structure on which they've depended and on which they've invested. Those local structures have existed since the Second World War, and in many cases earlier than that. So to implement what is proposed now and to create this sense of an energy union will require more legislation and more development of policy. And I think that that reflects a model of the way that Europe has developed over the last 50 years. Pushing forward, finding the barrier to what you want to do, and then moving forward again. Now, the paper does have one weakness, which I think deserves to be noted, in that it is extremely focused on the internal part of the argument around energy. It essentially sees, and I went through and listed the points on which this becomes obvious, it sees trade as external dependence and therefore a weakness, which it can be, but it isn't always. And it sees self-reliance and self-sufficiency as a good thing, which it can be, but it isn't always a good thing. And there is a sense, reading the paper, of an alternative which has not been explored, which is the idea of European energy security achieved through diversity of supplies, rather than through internal self-sufficiency. A diversity of sources, internal and external, matched with a well-connected market within the EU. And there's no sense in the paper that Europe is an energy importer now, which it certainly is. It's an importer because it's actually cheaper to be an importer than to push for self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency can carry a cost, and there are real echoes in what has been produced of the origins of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was built on exactly the same philosophy. I think it is a philosophical debate as to the value of self-sufficiency as against trade. I think it's serious and important. Different people can have different perspectives. And therefore, I was particularly sorry that the UK was not at the table. This document, which the Commission approved, was written by a network of 18 commissioners under the Slovak Vice President, who was very effective and very good. But he built a consensus across 18 commissioners working in different groups on different parts of the paper. The UK was not part of that group, despite the fact that we are one of the largest energy producers within the European Union because of North Sea oil and gas. despite the fact that we have a long traditional commitment to open markets as a way of meeting our needs. Lord Hill, who was our new commissioner, was, I was told by officials in Brussels, consulted, said he had nothing to say and nodded it through at the Commission meeting in March. I think the risk is that from this modest start, this policy will now grow and could grow in ways which suit some and don't suit others. And I fear that the fact that we weren't in the room, is indicative of the current policy stance on between Britain and Europe. The reality is that if we're not there, Europe will not stop moving forward, and we can't restrict our involvement in Europe to just working to defend the position of the financial sector in London. I don't think that is an adequate approach to the European Union. If we take that approach much longer, we will find, when we finally agree that we are and are going to remain members of the European Union, we'll find that Europe has moved on in ways that don't suit us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Nick, as you can see, is not only, from his background, has not only been advisor to governments over a number of years, but has also was very involved with BP, firstly as the Group Policy Advisor, and then as Group Vice President, Strategy and Policy. So that's a very much an overarching view of this whole issue. So we move on straight away to Stephen Tyndale, Research Fellow from the Centre for European Reform, and former Executive Director of Greenpeace.
Okay, thank you very much. I was delighted to be invited here tonight because I am strongly pro-European, and that's why I work at the Centre for European Reform, which wants to make Europe even better, but thinks it is very good already. And we're based in London, so that keeps us quite busy. And I also work on energy and climate change. I've done it for the last 25 years. So I clearly think that is the most important issue. And so the question, is an energy union a realistic possibility? I wish I could answer yes, but I'm afraid my answer is no. It's not a realistic possibility for some of the points that have already been made. Energy is central to foreign policy. That's why Angela Merkel will not agree to allow the Commission to coordinate how much she pays for Russian gas. Energy policy is central to the economy. Again, that's why Germany does not want to phase out the use of Russian gas, because it's pretty cheap for them. And the energy mix runs straight into the issue of subsidiarity, member states' powers versus the powers of the centre. And there is no way that member states are going to give up the power to choose their own energy mix. I mean, there was this slightly surprising agreement that there should be a 20% renewable energy target, which goes counter to that issue of member states being allowed to choose any energy mix they want. They have to include 20% renewables, which was a big step forward, but member states now are pretty cross that they did that, and so they won't. And the 20% renewable energy target by 2030 EU-wide, what does that mean? It means nothing, frankly. Each member state will just say, well, that's for someone else to do. So targets are much overused in the EU, and that particular target is particularly worthless. As both speakers have said previously, there's no agreement on energy mix. Nuclear has been mentioned. My view, having spent 20 years against it, is that it is necessary, particularly advanced nuclear, but the Germans, the Austrians, they're never going to change their mind on nuclear now. So nuclear is a divisive issue. Renewable energy, everyone says they're in favour of it, but what particular form of renewable energy, well, biomass, we could spend several hours discussing whether that's good or bad. I won't, you'll be pleased to hear. Onshore wind. The Conservatives have said no more subsidy for onshore wind. That would mean no more onshore wind, which is going to put everyone's electricity bills up. So that may be a political issue that they have to contend with. But renewables divide people. Fracking certainly divides people. The French and the Bulgarians and a lot of the German public are very anti-fracking. And carbon capture and storage. Again, the Germans are opposed to that. The German Greens, small g and large g Greens, having killed off nuclear, they now think CCS is the issue that they need to attack most. And they have this phrase, putting poison under your feet, which is nonsense because it's not wanting. But nevertheless, the fact that something is not true doesn't mean that it's not a good campaign slogan. So that is what they are saying about CCS. So, there isn't going to be an energy union. I'll try and be a bit more positive in the next couple of minutes. I think there is scope for progress on energy efficiency. The target for energy efficiency, first of all, it's not very ambitious, and secondly, it's not binding. Well, as I said, targets are overused, and it doesn't matter if the target is binding or not. What the Commission officials said last time we were discussing energy efficiency was binding measures are more important than binding targets. They're absolutely right. If you have a binding measure, you have a mandatory policy agreed at European level, everyone has to do it. And the Commission has enforcement powers, and it uses them. So the binding measure they proposed was that most new power stations should be combined heat and power, which means instead of allowing all the heat to go up the chimney and be wasted, it would actually be used. That is a very sensible policy. It's why Denmark, for example, is by far the most energy efficient country in the whole of the EU. And the Danes were the president when the Energy Efficiency Directive was agreed, but unfortunately they had to drop that because other governments, including the UK, including Germany, including all the people who claim to be green, they were opposed to it. So I think there is scope for energy efficiency progress. I think there is scope for some renewable energy progress. Trading of renewable energy, that's something the Commission has been promoting for a long time, without much success, actually without any success so far. And it doesn't matter where renewables occur, where the generation happens, as long as you can trade it. So the infrastructure is crucial, but the trading is also very important, and the Commission is commendably promoting that. And then investment is the third part of the way forward. The infrastructure needs a lot of investment. Smart grid is the kind of buzzword. Smart everything has to be smart. I don't know what that means. I'm not sure if the Commission does. A grid that is efficient and that can take electricity from the north of Europe to the south of Europe at night, for example, if there's lots of solar in the south, it's not going to generate at night, so they can use wind from the north. And similarly, we can use, in the north of Europe, we can use solar from the south, as long as there's a decent grid. And from the UK perspective, the North Sea grid is absolutely essential, covering a lot of cables across the North Sea, so that first of all we can harness the offshore wind power, and secondly so that we can use the storage facilities that they have in Scandinavia, all these hydro plants where you can pump water back uphill and then let it out when you need the electricity. That is a very major step forward, and the Commission, commendably, is saying that that is part of its priority. So where is the money for this going to come from? Where is the money for new and innovative renewables like tidal lagoons, which is a big, exciting possibility in the UK, in Wales specifically? And where is the investment for new generation nuclear going to come from? Well, let's stop wasting money on transport, building parallel motorways from one town to another. Far too much EU money has gone on that. And finally, let's stop wasting money on the International Nuclear Fusion Project, which has spent about 16 billion so far and is 30 years old.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Amelia Hadfeld, the Senior Lecturer in International Relations at Christchurch.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank for the invitation Professor John Brew from Regent's University, London, who gave me a very nice overview of the historic ethos of the place and the fact that it granted degrees to women. Struck me as a particularly important statement. I'd like to also thank Lord Hannay also for the invitation. I think some of the work that's come out of the senior European experts is incredibly important, and I would very much support the idea of everybody reading the various papers in their series. John suggested at the beginning, if we don't get energy right, we're going to get a lot of things wrong. And I agree. I think there's nothing, in a sense, more microcosmic, if you like, it's more of a macrocosm, than energy security at this time. I find myself sort of wedged between a variety of differing opinions, however. Andy suggesting, and quite rightly, that the member states are going to be a tough road to hoe, as they say in my part of the country. They do guard their powers jealously. Nick, who's very clearly a believer, and I think suggests quite rightly that what we have seen is a very symbolic and important development, a very ambitious reflection of a brand new commission, I think far more focused than we've seen in stagnating previous years. Balanced against Stephen's observations, don't want to quite use the word disbeliever, perhaps agnostic is a little bit more delicate. Certainly the idea that there's going to be very little scope for change. So I need to try to find my stance here in respect of the SEE paper. I think I'd like to start by quoting Jean Monnet. Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. I think that's a helpful starting point. The roles that Europe has played in energy have been very long-standing and vast, and it certainly doesn't fall to me to finish as the final speaker to go over them. But I'd like you to bear in mind maybe 4 of them that I think may play a very significant role in where energy is going to go in the future. First of all, clearly a catalyst, something that drives something on, as it was very much as part of the 1950 Schuman plan to set up and forge, literally, the coal and steel community. Second, something of a consolidator, refining current structures, possibly even legislation, burning away what's not needed and getting right down to the nitty-gritty. A corporation as well, and I think in a sense the Commission somehow comes off in this way, not always happily, streamlining according to the predominant political and market norm. And finally, a corpus, if I can put it this way, either of law or a group of actors, or even a sort of gathering of hard and soft technology. I think energy is going to function in all 4 of these manifestations as well. I very much enjoyed the SEE paper. I was surprised, however, to find maybe not quite as much foreign policy, which struck me as slightly odd in energy security as I would have liked. That's obviously because I'm hooked on foreign policy anyway. So I would like to perhaps suggest areas in which the paper might want to flesh this out, given the predominant geopolitical feeling we've had in Europe in the last year and a half as well. Certainly the role in energy is a difficult one, and the paper's right to point this out right at the beginning, limited in terms of the competence. And this is the very heart, I think, of where the competence tussle arises. And it's right at the beginning that it was commented that competence and the struggle for power is very much the linchpin of the current union proposal. If it's going to be circumvented or it's going to be watered down, we need to understand what's happening there. Certainly it's shared, it's a shared competence, but it's limited, I think, in the area that remains the most vital, and that's energy security. Simply because the purchase of energy type or the control of choice over a given supplier and methods of import used all lie extensively, if not indeed exclusively, within the hands of member states, sovereign, therefore, in political and to a degree in market terms as well. So the focus here, I think, that I would like to see is on the sort of implicit foreign policy requirements at the heart of the EU Energy Union proposal. I agree that I think the Union's proposal is ambitious, but I find it not particularly persuasive with regards to how it's going to tackle foreign policy. I'm still getting the same shoppiness sound that I tend to get when I read security strategies as well. So the question, therefore, is what needs to change? I think the easy answer is nothing. Just get on and finish the third energy package. Complete the damn energy market already. We're waiting. How long does it take? Or work down the European Energy Security Strategy, which is a very clever and focused document with a lot of substance to it, but that certainly hasn't been nailed down yet. But the tougher answer is, of course, everything needs to change. And I think on the spectrum of how tough that's going to be, we think we need to wake up to this. I think there's a soft sell and a medium sell and a hard sell. Sorry for the sort of typical North American spectrum there. The soft sell, of course, is just to watch the member states continue on in exactly the way that they've been doing for the past couple of years. They're going to continue to develop their own energy resources, emphasize sustainability, ethos, and renewable commitments. All that can be done quite effectively, I think. But I think it can be done most effectively at the NS level, the member state level. The mid-sell, perhaps, is to suggest the Commission wakes up and steps forward. The suggestion is as a contract interlocutor, looking very, very carefully at all of the energy contracts that have been signed, and on all subsequent energy contracts, overseeing all the details, even with the delicacy of a provision to protect sensitive information, which has come up in the last week. The hard sell is a tremendous change. Member states look carefully at relinquishing part or all of their ability to determine their energy mix, at least the mix that bears on the stability and the security of the Union as a whole. External energy purchase becomes effectively not wholly dissimilar from external trade. Supranationally managed by the Commission in key aspects, i.e. cross-border, anything above 50% reliance on a given energy type or provider, or where more than perhaps two or more sovereign borders are crossed. It may be a radical suggestion, but it's certainly not one that I haven't heard in the Commission. But why the hard sell? I think it might be time, with all respect to the innovation that we've seen in the Energy Union, to face up to the failures of the coal and steel community, the incomplete energy, and accept that energy, despite climate change being manifestly cross-border, collective, important, strategic, on a continental scale that goes to the heart of material survival and forms the institutions of the European Union as we know it. Despite all that, energy is still dealt with not merely nationally or even locally, but parochially, passively, and afflicted ever more, as the SCE paper quite correctly points out, by short-termism. Why else is it time for change? Well, the EU is more than halfway there, legislatively, in terms of the implications of gas and electricity regulations, as well as the sheer impact of EU law on competition and state aid, on commercial structures. The Commission is intent on unbundling, on deconstructing vertically integrated monopolies from EDF to Gazprom. Its additional competence in areas like environment, climate change target setting suggests that the EU is already rounding in top-down fashion on creeping supranationalization of energy, or at the very least, an increasingly asymmetric attitude to determining Europe's strategic energy mix in the favor of union-level solutions. So, I think that much is clear in the Energy Union's ethos. The problem, of course, is the member states. Despite the geopolitical differences of the states and their material needs, I think we should review the benefits of moving forward with a solid core of EU law legislating growing areas of energy market functioning, and the very sensible push towards interconnections and carbon-free countdowns on practically everything. You could conceivably move forward with an EU-level led union via the Commission. The only other option really is to have your faith in the member states and assume that they mean what they say in terms of Article 194, which of course calls for, indeed pleads for, member state solidarity on energy security. And I think they have to commit to this. This has to be more than a Christmas pledge drive. I think this has to be something you don't periodically subscribe to just in order to mitigate collective bad consciences about the latest contract you've just signed with Gazprom. Either sign with Gazprom as a whole and get the best deal from them in a way that genuinely spreads risk and reward, or get serious about the other dirty D word, diversification, and start shopping abroad. Let me just finish up in terms of the security of supply that the SEA paper touches on. First of all, security of supply needs to be defined in terms of security of demand and transit. It's an annoyingly broad, integrated spectrum of separate and not always sympathetic elements. Security of supply involves more than just one country's national resources. It's not just the assets, access, affordability, trinity. It's much more about contingency and continuity provision in terms of internal and external factors, from price hikes and weather spikes and infrastructure failure, or, at worst, deliberate politically motivated stoppage. The various scenarios that were run by the Commission in mid-2014 as part of the European Energy Security Strategy I found very helpful. They were the first real proof that the Commission was moving from its, if I may say, pathological attachment to paper-based analysis to some innovative strategic thinking, even if at the end they produced a sort of standard Commission-style shopping list at the end. A big part of vulnerability, which is very much at the heart of security supply, is political, historical, social, and psychological. It's perception, ladies and gentlemen, in other words. It's about who we are, what we need, where to come from, and why. There's an intrinsic us and them in virtually all of energy security. And I think that's how the member states feel it. I'm fairly sure that's how they read it. So the bedrock of political identities, underlying assumptions about how those identities should be guaranteed and secured in energy terms, even in our rush, however laudable, to standardize these, we forget them at our peril. I think the SEE paper therefore needs to feed in a little bit more in terms of the foreign policy structures and to address not only individual but the collective reliance on gas and oil. It is therefore, I think, important to remind ourselves, however green the ethos of the European Union is now, at present, we are still looking, I think, emphatically at a hydrocarbon-reliant future. Finally, in terms of the identities that I was just touching on, the identities of the us, and this will very much determine how the energy union plays out, must shift from the coagulation of member states into a genuine collective, a genuine union collective. The union has to be its own us in terms of collective negotiation and purchasing of gas, if it wishes to go that far. Because Russia is doing a pretty spectacular job of being a very unified them, at least in terms of overlaying Kremlin authority with Gazprom clout. So let's take the foreign policy seriously. Let's look to see it worked out a little bit more. And the solution, I think, is not easy. It's simply to be aware of our responsibilities to neighboring states in providing support and protection while attempting to depoliticize energy security, the policy area least conducive, perhaps, to any such attempt. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our four speakers. We have about 20 minutes for questions and comments. Please ask you to keep your questions or comments very short so that we can get as many as possible. And then at the end, I'll ask the speakers to comment back. So can I have questions? One over there, one there, one there, one there. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Cornelia Meyer, thank you very much for your excellent remarks, especially Nick Butler. That was a very good and a very valuable tour d'horizon. I have sort of comment question pertaining to 3 short points. First of all, you very correctly mentioned, we need diversity. There's no energy security without diversification of supply. It's very important. looking at common energy policy, very difficult to achieve if you leave the energy mix within the countries, but can be managed if you look at diversity of supplies and look at it globally. Secondly, it's very expensive. I mean, the EU is moving in decarbonizing, moving to the 20% in the case of the UK, the 30% renewables target. Very expensive to make sure the grids can manage that, to make it reliable. Who is going to finance it? How are we going to have it financed? Because we're really very cash strapped. And thirdly, sort of a word of caution. When I look at Germany, Switzerland, who decided, Austria decided we don't want nuclear anymore, very expensive. We do a lot of very expensive things, sort of knee-jerk reactions to things that happen, done by politicians. This is an incredibly long cycle of business. And we need, the politicians may not get sufficient also technical support. They come up with wonderful targets without seeing, can grids take it? Grids are very sensitive things. So I'm done. I see you. I'm done. These are my comments, questions.
Thank you very much. Sandra Henry, I think you'll try and take 2 or 3 questions together. There was one here.
Thank you very much. I certainly thought the point that you raised about foreign policy was extremely interesting. And what I'm worried about is that the EU looks at the pipeline and defense areas and doesn't connect them. For example, there's NATO and there's an energy policy. So one of those aspects which I think should be addressed by the EU is Turkey. And what are they doing about Turkey in terms of bringing it in? Because the new pipeline that's being discussed between Russia and Turkey is a supply for energy. And also, we're very dependent on NATO in terms of defense.
Thank you very much. There's a question there, yes.
Hello, my name is David Cotton. I've got a particular interest in this because I have just published a book called Climate Change, A Wake-Up Call. Now, that fits in, my conclusions fit in with the hard sell that Dr. Hadfield was talking about. Because I think what we've got to do is to negotiate and look at what is good for the world interest or the EU interest, rather than concentrating all the time on what is good for our own local personal interest. And this applies to energy supply and applies to lots of other things as well. What we have to remember is, although the supply of renewable energy has gone up over the last 35 years a bit, it needs to go up 7 times faster in the next 35 years, because by 2050 we need to be getting 80 or 90% of our energy from renewable sources, and we're not moving nearly fast enough in that direction. Discussing fracking or whatever is a side issue, because we're going to have to stop using natural gas anyway, so why bother starting on the fracking? Let's develop the renewables. Okay,
thank you very much. And there's one question here, and then we'll take
thank you, Raj. John Durham here. I wonder whether the speakers, who I like your contributions very much, are aware of what's going on in Delft on Friday. I'm flying over tomorrow evening. There will be 350 people from all over Europe and all over North America talking about a totally new approach to nuclear, where we get the costs of nuclear down below the cost of coal, clearly below the cost of fracking, below the cost of gas and the rest, and I would love to think that nuclear can be called, bracketed with renewable, because basically it is 100% green. And what will also be shown is that it's possible to burn all the existing waste from the nuclear reactors, which was one of the biggest reasons that Germany went against it. Now, all this will be covered. Now, it's interesting, there will be at least 6 companies worldwide presenting their designs for a solution, related to that. The big guys won't be there. The big guys are totally defensive for they're hugely expensive constructs like the Hinkley Point one, which probably will not go ahead. But there'll be 6 of them, and some of them will not be, cheap ones. Bill and Melinda Gates are not small players in this game. They will all be there on Friday. That is the day after tomorrow.
I think we will get some comments from
I'm going to be there.
all of those 4 questions. So would you like to start?
I won't try to answer them all. I'll just focus on
Yes.
on 1 or 2. I think you're absolutely right. One of the disappointments of this report is that it is Europe alone, and there is no sense in it of the world beyond the member states, either in terms of potential diversity of supplies or in terms of what's happening to the energy system and the threats and the opportunities that poses. I think the thinking is just far too narrow. I was in India yesterday, which probably explains why I spoke so slowly. And the scale of the issues that they face in trying to fuel double-digit growth, which is what they're aiming for, over the next 20 years, without completely relying on coal, is an enormous issue. And I think that Europe should see these issues in world terms, and as well as the absence of an outside view, a broad view. I thought the other thing that wasn't there, and it comes to your point, is that there's nothing in this paper on science. There's nothing in this paper on potential movements in technology. It might be nuclear, new nuclear, modular, or it might be solar, it might be something else, I don't know. But Europe should be a centre of world science and technology and innovation, and that should help us to solve this problem. And the fact that it wasn't there, I think, is just a poverty of thinking.
I'm going to go first to Stanford's one, if I may. Of course, naturally, I agree. There should be, I think, a clearer reflection on how foreign policy is articulated within the European Union's energy union, and also how energy security provisions are articulated within the EU's foreign policy tools. For me, that's a natural symbiosis, and a very uneven one. So I think we need to be that out. I don't see the EU talking strategically about energy very much today, so I think that's certainly something that could be done on a lot more level. And I agree very much with regards to Turkey. It's always struck me as absolutely daft in the extreme. You don't just look at the map with regards to the incredible economy that Turkey affords the continental Europe in terms of its mainland opportunities. It goes from not necessarily a cheap option, but geopolitically it's certainly the least sensitive or had been I was grateful for David's comment. I will, of course, rapidly buy the book. I'm sure we should all buy the book. I like the idea of looking in terms of the collective interest with regards to the hard sell. You're quite right. I mean, a stratospheric acceleration in order to be able to and we don't tend to admit to that as well. I was unaware of what was happening in Delft, but I know now, which is great. Thank you very much. I don't know if I can quite make it for myself, but I will try. I'm aware because I think I'm not sure if the Canadians are there. The CANDU reactor is as much as I know. So
CANDU is existing.
Yes.
But terrestrial energy is brand new and totally different.
I agree that the idea of nuclear being the affordable option, I think, is something we need to think about. If we can rechristen it, I think, as 100% green, perhaps we shift the paradigm, and that's really the only way forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Would you like to comment now or after questions? Well, let's take on 2 more questions. Don't get too worried, please, that we're going to go until 9 o'clock, because we're not. We'll finish at 7:15 sharp, and then we'll have an opportunity for some drinks and an opportunity to meet with the speakers. Yes, the gentleman there, yes.
turn the focus a little bit from the top down to the bottom up, and also come back to the question about tradable energy. It does seem odd to me, at least, that in the context of the EU energy policy, we've got a plethora of national subsidy regimes for various forms of alternative energy production. We also have some complicated technical issues regarding the smart grid. Now, if we're going to have internationally tradable renewable energy, would this not perhaps be worth investigating in terms of having an EU-wide fiscal arrangement for an equivalent subsidy across the board for different kinds of alternative energy? As far as I know, this does not exist at the moment. And I think related to that, in terms of energy security and supply, in other areas, as I think I'm right in saying, the EU is beginning to insist more and more on seeing the European Union as the dominant market, no longer the national markets which count. And therefore the question of security of supply, by definition, therefore, becomes security of supply for the whole of the European Union market. So I'd be interested in hearing the panel's views on how far from the commercial side you see some scope for development, both in this way and also in terms of putting a common fiscal regime together to help the transfer, the international transfer of energy on, from alternative sources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Dr. Bakrami, you might like to comment. Dr. Bakrami is responsible as director for our MSc in oil and gas here, and he'll sit at the back there. In the middle there.
Thank you very much, Professor Drew. I totally agree with the remark that has been said. Actually, I think the major points and the challenges have been definitely drawn. I have a single question. I totally agree with you, Stephen, when you said that the danger is in economy when the instruments will become objectives, or when we have targets not followed by measurements. We definitely had a target to reach renewables by 20%. But did we have any concern for the increase, unexpected increase in the last 3 years in the use of coal, especially in the countries that are using renewables? So I'd like to use or to see the cup from the other half. And this is my question. If this is a concern, yes or no? If it is yes, is there anything in the pipeline to be done about the other side of the renewables?
Other comments or questions? Lord Henley.
Thank you. This is addressed to those of the panel who put a lot of emphasis on the need for a bigger foreign policy content, from which I think probably boils down in the end to Russia, largely, because the idea of some central organization in Brussels deciding that Turkmenistan is a better bet than Iran or whatever it is sounds to me pretty much a fantasy. But if the combination of energy union policies could get the European dependence on Russian gas down from the 30% roughly now to, say, 15, 18%, if you could ensure that there are no longer any member states who have a ridiculously disproportionate dependence on the Russian market, 100% you have for countries like Bulgaria and others. If you could do those two things, surely the market itself would tilt in a more favourable direction to buyers within Europe when dealing with Gazprom, because it's the disproportionate size of Gazprom's supply position which gives them rather a strong position. And given the Russian dependence on exports of gas, if you tilted that away a bit further, I would have thought the market itself would play a lot better.
Thank you. I think we're just adjusting the glasses rather than the question. Okay. I think we'd like to ask you, Stephen, if you would comment and
Thank you. The three questions. On the issue of financial support or subsidy, or whatever we want to call it, in theory, yes, there should be a EU-wide system. The member states should be allowed to give different rates of subsidy to different technologies. I mean, solar makes more sense in Greece than it does in Finland. But the coordination would be sensible. The Commission has tried to do this, but was rejected on subsidiarity grounds. And so, rather than trying to harmonise, Centre for European Reform has done a very good paper on this by David Buchan, which is worth reading on our website, looking at the possibility of just coordinating. So that, for example, I mean, I don't want to go into details, but you can either do it on the basis of renewal certificates, on the basis of feed-in tariffs, and at the moment we have a mix of both. You could just go for one approach and then allow member states to set the rate. But Cornelia, I think it was at the beginning, saying it was expensive. Yes, it's expensive. It's a lot cheaper than not doing it, and the Stern review is still worth reading. And where does the money come from? Well, apart from my other suggestions earlier, I would say let's end subsidies to fossil fuels. The G20 in 2009 agreed to phase out inefficient subsidies to fossil fuels. With lots of academic studies and IEA studies and so on since then showing that almost all the subsidies are inefficient, so let's get rid of them. And the subsidy levels to fossil fuels are far higher than the subsidy levels to renewables. On the increase of coal use, I mean, this is partly because of Merkel's U-turn on Fukushima, but it's partly also because the emissions trading system is, frankly, such a waste of space. And the cap and trade system has not worked. It could work if there was a floor price, which the UK government has introduced, but having that just in the UK doesn't make any sense. It damages UK competitiveness. The CBI is correct on that, so it should be Europe-wide, but probably won't be. And finally, Lord Hannay's point. I would say, yes, we need to talk about foreign policy, we need to talk about energy security, but we also need to talk about human rights. And the Commission is rather lax in its attention to human rights. So yes, we need to stop buying Russian gas because that funds Putin's war machine, but we should not instead buy gas from Azerbaijan because that is, the dictator there is almost as bad a human rights record, or possibly even worse than Putin. So you won't often hear a climate campaigner say best to use coal, but I would rather see coal burned than Azeri gas.
Thank you very much, Amelia.
Thank you very much. Alessandro, just to your question, I think you're correct. At this point, there is not, but perhaps there should be, the idea of harmonising subsidies on renewables. But I have to agree with Nick. I think more on the point that everything in Europe should strike for standardisation and harmonisation at this point, not necessarily because subsidies are have proved to be a particularly good thing, but if they continue to be market capitalist in the way they have been, and clearly engaging with the international and commercial structure, there should be some sort of cross-border agreement on that as well. I agree also. I think the ETS is a bit of a waste of space. It's dead, but I wonder whether it's gone. And I think the question of states that find themselves in this sort of unhappy halfway house of achieving renewables, but in a sense on the basis of some quiet coal burning without having cracked on carbon capture and sequestration, put them in a sort of ridiculous position of ticking both boxes at once as well. Lord Hannah, thank you very much. I'm really pleased that we have been talking about foreign policy, so I think we're certainly getting there. You're quite right. I mean, obviously Russia is the exogenous variable, like we use international relations language, the major push on the outside, and you're quite right. Human rights have not been dealt with efficaciously enough within energy security. There's not enough normative content, if I can put this way, within the European energy security. It's nowhere mentioned in the energy union, and it should. There's clearly scope and space for that as well. I don't know if I meant to suggest a fantasy. I think what I was looking at in terms of the potential collective decision-making of states looking at where to buy gas and oil only when it touches upon the strategic interest of the Union as a whole, as we were talking about when you start having that continental mindset as well. I think it's probably quite right. The market should indeed have monopolistic elements removed from it and would therefore absorb and sort of away exactly as you suggested. That's Adam Smith as much as anybody else. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll ask Nick to comment.
Let me try and answer David's point. I don't think the foreign policy issue is just about Russia. I think the foreign policy issue is really about establishing a range of good trading partners. Russia should be one, but not the only one. The fact that it is the only one for 6 or 7 countries in Eastern Europe is the heart of the problem of overdependence. And I think that means that we have to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, not just within the EU, but between the EU and the outside market. And that means Central Asia via Turkey. I think it means Egypt. I think it means if you take a long view, and you have to in an industry like energy, I think it means looking to the links to Kurdistan and even Iran. If there is a deal, they will be a significant world energy supplier. And Europe, whether we like all their policies or not, Stephen, I think we should be trading with them and hoping that through trade you make some improvement. And on the point on tax, I agree completely with Steve. This starts with a carbon price. If we can get a proper carbon price, a lot flows from that. If we had a carbon price, we certainly wouldn't be using so much coal now. But it's got to be way higher than anything we've seen in the last 5 years. It's probably got to be 40, 50 euros a tonne, maybe even more, to make people change their behaviour and to replace the capital stock which is being used at the moment. And then I think if we've got that, then we come to the earlier point on rational fiscal arrangements across the energy sector, including renewables, but one step at a time, and we haven't yet managed to take the first step.
Thank you very much, Nick. And then perhaps I'll ask Andy, who was very responsible for, with the senior European experts, in making this evening happen and writing this report. Have the last word.
Thank you very much, and thank you for what I think has been a very informative debate. I'll just go back to the 3 questions I asked. Is there anything new in this? Is it ambitious enough? Is it deliverable? I think if you look at the individual parts, there isn't actually anything new. But what is new is pulling it together in the way they have, in wrapping it in an envelope which they call Energy Union, which is perhaps overblown and pretentious, but actually holds something together, and it looks and feels a bit more like a strategy than we've ever seen before. So I think there is something, I agree with Nick, as we say in this country, that what the Commission have done is launch something that could develop a life of its own as a result of the change. Secondly, is it ambitious enough? Well, clearly, for everybody who's said what we need is the Union to get together, have a hard sell, if I can use that expression, and behave like a single unified country, of course it's not ambitious enough. But if the Commission had come along and proposed something that effectively transferred competence for energy to the Union and gave all the instruments to the Union, it would have been dead in the water before it had been even published. So the Commission has to live in a political world as well, and of course, as we all know, politics is about the art of the possible. However, I think within all of that, I would identify 3 things. First of all, the internal market. The Commission has its own powers to force member states to adopt the legislation, and indeed to force companies to abide by competition law. It's taking on Google. Well, if it can take on Google, it can take on Gazprom, it can take on RWE, it can take on the others. And the Commission says it will. Well, let's
let's hope it does, because if you have an internal market, the more that market is operating as a single interchangeable border-free zone, then the more you have that common European perspective adopted rather than the national one that you have. Secondly, on diversification, of course that's the right strategy to deal with the dominance, particularly from supplies, particularly of gas from Russia. And I don't think, I think perhaps it's been understated here today, the extent to which the Commission will want, and I think some member states in particular would like to work on Caspian supplies, on African supplies, and I hope eventually on American supplies of gas in order to help achieve that. And I think finally, the Commission, the Union does have to do something to defend the vulnerable countries, and what I mean by that is those countries who are dependent on gas supplies and are being are suffering because of that dependency. And there are member states who won't go anywhere near what Donald Tusk said in giving them a common purchasing power. There's a lot that can be done short of that would help to defend those countries from abuse. Is it deliverable? Come back in 3 years' time. I think a lot of it will be.
Well, thank you very much. I have just 2 points to make before we close. Professor Cooper, the Vice-Chancellor, asked me particularly to send his best wishes to you. Hope you'll enjoy it during the chat afterwards, and apologises that he wasn't able to be with us because he was particularly interested in the subject. The second is that on the 5th of May, we have an evening here which I really commend to you. It's called Youth Employment, Europe and Values. And you'll find two of the speakers, all 4 are very good. 2 of them are 2 of the top 10 speakers in the world. And I think you'll find a very interesting time at our Jean Monnet Memorial Flagship Lecture, if you're free. And you'll Google it, and we'll also send some information to you about it. And then could I call on our student who is going to say a few words. Mr. Ward is reading finance here, but he obviously is looking at the energy sides of finance. Over to you.
I'd just like to start by saying, on behalf of the Student Union of Regent University London, just a great thank you to Nick Butler, Stephen Tyndale, Andy Lebrecht and Dr. Amelia Hanfield for coming here today and just giving us your fascinating insights on whether the possibility of an energy union is actually possible. So thank you, it's a great privilege to have you here. I think today it's been a great pleasure to have this kind of discussion. A day like this is such a relevant time. Has been absolutely fantastic, and it's a great pleasure to have it hosted here at Regent. And now I'd just like to say I welcome all of you to come to the back afterwards and enjoy some refreshments, and we have a networking session.